We have never been in the control seat. It's just that we thought for a long time that we were. And what these crises right now teach us is that we are not masters of nature.
Hello and welcome to the Sinneswandel podcast. My name is Marilena Behrens and I'm happy that you decided to listen to today's episode. Some of you are probably already wondering, why all of a sudden in English? Well, first of all, this is an exception. The reason is that today's episode was recorded during an event with international guests, a live podcast sort of thing, I guess. And my guest at this event was none other than the philosopher Markus Gabriel. Maybe you already know him. And since he just recently published his new book, The Human Animal, Why We Still Do Not Fit Into Nature, there was a public book launch at the New Institute in Hamburg. And I had the pleasure of hosting it. After the talk, a vivid discussion followed, which we, however, are not allowed to publish due to data protection rights. But I'm sure the conversation with Markus Gabriel already offers a lot. We will get to that in a moment. First of all, I would like to apologize for the sound quality. Due to the location, there's a bit more noise than usual, but I hope you will excuse that and you can nevertheless, or maybe because of that, dive deeper into the atmosphere of the conversation. And if you want to dive even deeper into the topic, we are giving away a personally signed copy of The Human Animal among all those who support Sinneswandel and thus also me and my work as steady members. For more information and how you can participate, please check out the show notes. And now, let's begin. Thank you very much for the invitation. I feel honored and I'm pleased to guide and moderate through today's evening and the conversation. And I suspect most of you sitting here already know him, but for those of you who have not stumbled across the name Markus Gabriel yet, here's a little introduction. He's not only the academic director of this building, the New Institute, but he's also one of the most prominent representatives of a new realism, which is an essential factor of his project of a new enlightenment. At the age of only 29, he became the youngest full professor of philosophy in Germany at the University of Bonn, where he's still holding today the chair of epistemology, modern and contemporary philosophy. Markus Gabriel has been awarded numerous prizes, fellowships, and visiting professorships. And his books have been translated into many different languages, but not his new book, though. And that is also one of the reasons why today's conversation will be held in English, to give as many of you here in the room the chance to participate in the discussion later. And I promise there's enough reason to do so, because the book Markus has written concerns all of us, provided you see yourself as a human being. But I guess most of you do. But do you also consider yourself an animal? I guess that's worth discussing. What is it to be human? This question Kant already asked himself hundreds of years ago. And it is exactly this question that Markus is raising again in his new book called The Human Animal, Why We Still Do Not Fit Into Nature. Because it is on this question, or rather the answer to it, that our life as humans depends on. Why? I'm very sure the author will explain to us in a minute. Welcome. So, Markus, since the publication of your last book, Moral Progress in Dark Times, to be honest, the future doesn't look necessarily brighter. looking at all these different crises, whether it's climate change or the corona pandemic, inflation, wars, it looks like the crises are multiplying. And so my first question is, does this mean that we are morally regressing?
Well, I think moral progress always goes hand in hand with backlashes in the shape of moral regresses. So what we have been witnessing in a very visible way over the last 3 years, certainly ignited by the pandemic as the first completely synchronized human behavioral scheme of all times. So we need to become aware of this fact, right? For the first time in human history, all humans, and there have never been more of us, at the same time have been engaged in roughly the same type of activity, fighting the pandemic, right? Digitally orchestrated and connected with each other. And this has certainly led to, forms of discovery about the nature of the crises that we're in, which on the one hand, I think facilitated forms of moral progress. Think of Black Lives Matter, a growing awareness of the impact of the climate catastrophe. The list would be much longer, of course, if you look at the progresses that we have also seen in the last 3 years. While on the other hand, we saw all those regresses, right? I mean, just the fights about the objectivity of science at the pandemic, the relationship between politics and science, recent elections, and not to mention, of course, the obvious geopolitical situation that we're in. So I think whenever you have rapid moral regress, at the same time, there's going to be a backlash. And right now, we seem to be in the backlash moment. But I predict that we will get another, wave of progress right after this, and that will be very soon.
So it's not a linear progress, but more of like, even if we are regressing, we are still learning from the experience that we are facing during the crisis, if I understood that right.
Exactly. Just think about the horrible war that's currently raged against Ukraine, right? And the fact that hardly anybody, right, is in a position right now who knows the elementary facts about what's going on to think that, two sides might have roughly the same rights, right? I mean, just the very idea that the Russian aggressors are in the same moral, ballpark as those attacked right now, this idea doesn't even make sense. And I think that is also another case of moral progress, though at the cost of victims, right? So I'm not saying that there's any kind of theodicy or ethidodacy that is a justification of moral progress, in the name of victims. Victims are victims, full stop, right? But here again, we have a case of progress that at the same time is accompanied by a type of regress. And however horrible this war is, right, it's still, in a certain sense, right, less bad because constrained by certain still elementarily recognized moral practices, if you compare this to the wars of the 20th century. So for the time being, you see there's some kind of constraint even on this form of radical evil.
So in your new book, The Human Animal, this is also intended to contribute to moral progress, or to speak more accurately, to show ways how we can achieve moral progress. And while progress in general, in many people's mind, is connected with technology, for example, artificial intelligence or even human transcendence, your approach is quite different to that, because it leads to the animal, or more precisely, the animal in us. And I think for some people this might sound like a step backwards, or something like back to nature, naturalism. And that's why I would like to ask you, why do you consider thinking about the animal inside us to be future-oriented?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that we have seen a lot of futurology, in particular associated with, technological, economic, and scientific progress. And these types of promises and ideas about the future turn out, on closer inspection, to be delusional. Right? The whole Harari business and all of this, I think, is a bunch of delusions. If you analyze this closer, it hardly ever corresponds to the facts. It's empty narrative myth-making, as Harari himself admits. If you read *Sapiens* and *Homo Deus* more closely, what he will tell you is precisely this, right? That he's an ideologue. The book is about narrative-making, and he produces a narrative, like other authors before him who had a political agenda. Nietzsche, for instance, right? And other authors. So these books are not in the business of fact stating about the future, but they seem to be fact stating. And a lot of trans and post-humanist discourse surrounding technology on closer inspection through the lenses of actually informed humanistic, social scientific, and generally scientific research turns out to be empty nonsense. And one way of fighting this, then, of replacing fantasies of overcoming the human, is to say, well, let's look at the human animal much more closer and see which kinds of transcendence so much as minimally make sense. And this is what this book is fundamentally about. How can we draw a distinction between us and our animality, while at the same time recognizing finitude, vulnerability, and all those processes in us that ground us in a nature that we cannot control even in principle, due to, among other things, the fact that we are, nowhere near having deciphered all of its complexities.
I think some people would already be like, I thought we live in the Anthropocene scene. Wow, difficult word in English. So we are we can control the nature around us. But I think we need to step back first and to understand the concept that you tell in your book. Because in the first chapter of your book, you tackle exactly this question: what makes us human? Because you were talking about the difference that we make between human and animal. And one of the interesting answers that I found while reading your book, and I like to state this quote, is, "We are not born as animals, we become animals." And some of you might think oh, I know this quote from somewhere, from a philosopher. And maybe you can explain to us why what the sentence really means.
Well, famously, this is part of Simone de Beauvoir's mode of correcting certain mistakes in Sartre's philosophy of the human condition, la réalité humaine, as Sartre said. And I think Simone de Beauvoir got many things right that Sartre got wrong. And this is one of them, right? I mean, this famous quote, right? "We are not born women, we become women," right? This is a particular point about what it is to be something as a human. To be something as a human, including being human, and that's what I add in this book, always depends on the type of image or conception that you have of yourself. Humans are those life forms, or animals, as we can say for the time being, that do what they do in light of a conception of themselves. We are self-interpreting animals, as the philosopher Charles Taylor has put it. Right? We all have conceptions of nature, of humans, what distinguishes us from other animals, from inanimate nature, etc. Some more scientific conceptions and other less scientific. And that's the starting point of this reflection. That's constitutive of who we are. Right? So how we think of ourselves is part of who we are. That does not mean that there aren't any facts about us, right? So either, for instance, we have an immortal soul or we don't. But it matters for who you are if you think that you have one, right? So if someone is a believer and they believe that they have an immortal soul, then this defines them as a believer, regardless of the fact whether they have such a soul or not. And what I do in this book now is I claim that the concept of an animal has the status of the concept of an immortal soul. It's a flawed concept from the past, and if you look closer at it scientifically, etc., then it plays a particular role in the human life form, a role that has largely nothing to do with actual biological and zoological facts. This is the starting point of the book. So if you think of yourself as an animal, right, you emphasize this. You say, after the Darwinian revolution, I want to think of myself as an animal, and thereby I do not have an immortal soul, right? If this is the emphasis that you give to I am an animal, right, or I am part of nature, we're all part of nature, and we should stop destroying that of which we are a part. If this is your interpretation of your animality, then that's one way of becoming an animal, and there are different ones. And what I do in this book is I kind of criticize all of them by arguing that, the term animal has a meaning, namely the one that I just gave to it, but there is no real, non-fictional, non-imaginary meaning to this. There is no reality of human life where we are animals, just as there's probably no reality of human life where we have an immortal soul. If I get this wrong, then I will apologize to God later.
So if I understood you right, we need the animals to get a picture of who we are. And the interesting fact is that you also state that humans are animals that don't want to be animals. Because as soon as we have identified ourselves as animals, we are striving to get rid of the animality inside us. Because we want to identify ourselves with exactly this part that distinguishes ourselves from the animals. And why are we doing this? Is it that we feel offended by this realization of being animals because they are wild in our heads, or why?
Well, indeed, I think that if you look at the history of thinking of ourselves as animals, at least one history, there are many histories, right? But if you look at the documented philosophical history of thinking about ourselves as animals, right? Say, paradigmatically what happened with Aristotle, right? As one starting point. Again, there are different histories, there are oral histories. It's not that we know everything about how our ancestors, different ancestors, thought about their animality. But if we look at the documented history, it typically goes like this. We are surrounded by these other beasts, right? Many of them are very dangerous, lions and snakes and so forth, right? And they are there. You know, they're part of the manifest image of reality. We see them crawling around. And there's something that we share with them, life and movement, as opposed to the plants. They just stand around. They don't move. They can also be dangerous, but they stand around. So the first thought is that those crawling, dangerous creatures, they share something with us, maybe a mind. And then there are these plants. There's something that we don't share with them. And then the question became, why aren't we quite like them? Why don't we just fit into this landscape, right, of lions and gazelles? Why do we watch the scene from the cave, as it were, or literally from the cave? Think about cave paintings. And I think this is when humans started thinking about themselves as distinct and yet belonging to this animal kingdom. And what's human then about us cannot be what we share with them, right? That's what we share with them. So the interesting idea was then, what is it that makes us human as opposed to them? And then we get a host of answers. Rationality, language, even Jane Goodall would say, I had this conversation with her, it's language, very old school, right? Morality, whatever it is, building nuclear power plants, war, aggression, religion, there are all these candidates around, right? What makes us play, there are all these distinctions. This is what makes us human. But then what these distinctions miss is the question, well then what is it that makes us animals, right? Because this would not make us animals of a particular kind. This would make us animals plus something else. I call this the two-body problem, right? Because now you have kind of two bodies. Your animal body, that's exactly like the body of a lion, and then this other weird body, right? Which might be a soul inhabiting you or a life force, whatever it is. And I think all of this is completely flawed. And for this reason, we need a new conception of what it is to think of ourselves as both continuous with these life forms, because we're subject to similar evolutionary processes. We consist of cells, we need water and liquids of different forms and fats and all of this, right? This is biological in us, and at the same time, we are not identical with these biological processes. So there's a meaningful question that our ancestors asked, but for one thing, they also just didn't know the first thing about these other creatures. Aristotle was a horrible biologist, and it wasn't his mistake, right? How could he have known better? By the way, Darwin was not much better, right? It's not that Aristotle bad biologist, Darwin great. And Darwin clearly said what sets us apart completely in The Descent of Man. Darwin did not think that we are animals, right? Is the categorical imperative. He quotes Kant in German in The Descent of Man and says, we have the categorical imperative, they don't. So Darwin goes all out on humans are not animals. Just on a side note, I looked into the evidence. You will find this in the book.
But if we are animals, but not merely animals, what is it then what distinguishes us from them? Because you said there is something.
Yes. So I think it manifests itself, like I use a very German word for this. It's technical, so let me just be German and use a very German philosophy word for this, Geist. Right? I want to say it
I
like...
I want to say it in spirit, but...
Yeah, spirit doesn't work. Exactly, right? So what is it? I sometimes just translate it as human-mindedness. Now, here's what I mean by this, right? Again, it's the capacity to live life in light of a conception of oneself, which paradigmatically manifests itself in moral progress. that is in largely socially orchestrated behavioral changes. Very simple example. Lions do not discuss whether they should become vegetarians in order not to hurt those gazelles. Right? It's not a discussion they have.
Are you sure? Yeah. How do you know?
Well, they don't have discussions. I would start there, right? But of course, if now the lionologists tell me, oh no, they tried, right? They failed in the 16th century, and they returned to a gazelle-eating life form, right? I'm open-minded about this, but it doesn't strike me as very likely, right? And so they don't do that, and certainly they don't write treatises about this, right? So, and then other primates, say bonobos, right, don't consider becoming feminists. So even if there are cases in other primates, I again had that debate with Jane Goodall, where a bunch of females kill an alpha male, they don't ever replace the alpha male by an alpha female. What they do is they just didn't like that alpha male. Right? So the idea that, hey, maybe something's wrong with our society, and then this never happens. Humans do this all the time. In this sense, we are historical creatures. And I think this is where the action is. The capacity to do what one does in light of a self-conception. And, it has something to do with language. There might be modules of the mind that you need in order to be there. But I think it's a genuine, irreducible part of human reality.
So what makes us human, if I understood that right, is that we have a concept of who we are and that we can change.
Yes.
And this distinction doesn't make us superior above animals or other living beings, but makes us have a special responsibility towards them. You write in your book.
Exactly.
What is this responsibility? What is it about?
Yeah, so in the Buddhist tradition, some early reports on what the Buddha might have said, right, up to Hans Jonas and elsewhere, you find the following principle, which I find completely convincing. That over which you have power is that towards which you have responsibility. So there's a mode of thinking about power where power can be misused, right? It's the political power. Xi Jinping got too much power, right? That's one way of thinking about power. And then power is constantly a threat, right, to those over which someone has power. That's one way of thinking about power. But why not think about power, right? There are scenarios where people have power, parents over children, say, right? Where you have power over someone, and that power is the origin of your morally laden responsibility. And I think that this is our relationship to other living beings. The fact that we know that they're living beings, we can dissect them, we know what they're made of, we can analyze their genetic codes, we can cure them, right? We operate, one of our dogs just had an eye operated, right? And we had long discussions. Should the dog be killed, or can she live without an eye, etc., right? So we have power over that dog, and therefore moral responsibility, right? We didn't throw it away. It's like, it's a broken dog, right? And so the power over the living beings is the source of our responsibility. They do not have that responsibility towards us. So if a lion kills my daughters, it's a tragedy for me, right? But if I kill the lion's daughter out of sadism, it's evil. So there's a categorical difference because they don't have that power over me. And I think I start with that reflection in the book, and you see this will change our conception of what we call nature, living beings, and ecological responsibility, because we don't have this conception of we are in the Anthropocene, we are super powerful, and we are destroying the planet. I think it's false. By the way, we're not in the Anthropocene. There's a reason why geologists have never accepted that claim. It's been a hypothesis, it's never been verified, it's not a serious scientific claim. We're not in the Anthropocene. It's again a mode of overestimating our power. We are in a horrible scenario, but it's not the Anthropocene.
And maybe the times that we are in, they show that the idea of the Anthropocene doesn't really work, looking at climate change, for example, or the pandemic.
Exactly, right? I mean, if we talk about the Anthropocene, then typically, again, we are stuck in what philosophers call the manifest image as opposed to the scientific image. In the manifest image, right, there are the things we see. We see the gazelles and the elephants, right? And we can see that we can shoot them. But we can't shoot the viruses. We just tried and failed, okay? So we shot with big guns at clouds of virions. Great idea, right? I mean, it's the best that we have. But of course, we couldn't end the pandemic. right? You can't end a pandemic as it's ongoing because the viruses have power over us. And so just looking at the microorganisms, right, just that fact, and the fact that most of the biomass that you see in front of you, right, where I am with my body, right, most of this is microorganisms. My microbiome is, very heavy compared to me.
So if we move on by thinking that we can overcome the problems, the crisis that we are facing by dominating nature, we probably will fail, if I understand you right.
Yes.
So we need a new picture of nature and who we are. And this is the second chapter that, or the idea of the second chapter of your book. So if you were asking yourself, where are we in the book? We are progressing, we are at the second chapter. It's about the question of meaning in life, a central question of philosophy. And that's why I would like to ask you, why does it matter to you or to all of us regarding the questions that we asked us before?
Yes, we do ask this question. We have this uncanny feeling that it matters how we think about ourselves in respect to nature as the type of living beings that we are, right? Does any of this make sense fundamentally? Is there a meaning to life? And if there's a meaning to life, what do we mean? A meaning to life in the sense of biological life? Was it intended? Does it necessarily come about on planet Earth, right? What exactly are we asking? And I think it matters to us what the meaning of life is for good reasons. I don't think it's a nonsensical question. And in this chapter, I distinguish between the meaning in life question, about which there's a lot of good philosophical literature. In what activities do we find meaning? And the meaning in life can be highly individual. Some people find it in painting, others in philosophy, right? Still others in a particular type of job, and then some others are deprived of even trying to find it because they suffer from the fact that they have to do alienated labor for me so that I can find my meaning in life, right? So for this reason, of course, we should orchestrate our socioeconomic affairs so as to generate a socioeconomic system that allows every individual to be in a position to find their meaning in life. I think that should be the imperative of any liberal democratic society. And that's the first part, right? The meaning in life. But I think we should go further than this, because the meaning in life is connected, that debate, for which we have social welfare measures of trying to begin to tackle it, to the question of the meaning of life, the deeper metaphysical problem, right? Are we more or less, right, roughly speaking, a random product of evolutionary processes, right? We're here and then we're gone and then some other, beasts take over or whatever, Planet of the Apes scenario or something worse, Planet of Corona, right? So is this coming, right? And then, well, that's that. Or might it be the case that there's a reason for the fact that some living beings are there to ask these moral questions? And I do opt in the book for the later. So I do argue in this book that the meaning of life is the fact that creatures are there, us, who are capable of being the guardians of moral progress. I think that's the meaning of life. And then you see the meaning of life, my answer to what it is connected to the meaning in life and to a particular conception of liberal democracy as orchestrating social welfare. Yeah? So that's what I do in the second chapter of the book.
Yeah, and to the point of social welfare and political and social freedom, I'd like to get on the next question. But first, I'd like to make sure that I understood right what you understand, what your idea is of like objective meaning of life. Like, it sounds like there's an answer to it. Not only the individual meaning in life, but something like you call it in your book. I hope I translated correctly, otherwise correct me. The fields of sense that we have and that makes it possible for us to experience this meaning.
Yes, absolutely. That's again the correct translation, and also thanks already, Marilena, for suggesting the translation of the German title into English as The Human Animal. I think that's a brilliant proposal. That's what's going to happen with the English translation. So thanks for that. You'll get the relevant credit. So that's a really perfect translation. In German, it's der Mensch als Tier with a particular pun, but in English, the human animal does exactly that job. So thanks. So yeah, fields of sense. So the idea is that, like one picture of reality that many people still hold, and I think it's arguably and demonstrably false, is that reality is a bunch of in itself sense and meaningless processes, right? A bunch of matter and energy distributed over fields, governed by laws of nature. That's one picture, right? I mean, they are like whatever, bosons and fermions, and they're all subject to the laws of nature on different scales. Right, the big stuff subject to relativity theory, the big and and then the small stuff subject to quantum mechanics, and the fast and big stuff to whatever quantum field theory, right? And there are debates to be had about this. But one picture is this, right? Meaning and senseless particles swarming around in a gigantic universe, and their behavior completely and perfectly explainable by physics at the end of the day, maybe with some other natural science. That's a very widespread worldview. It's the religion of our time. I think it's a wrong worldview. I think this is false. So what's the alternative? Well, obviously thinking that meaning and sense is already there. That's also that's also why mathematics is the right way of thinking about the universe on so many levels, right? Think of, when I say fields of sense, think of, for instance, vectors. We represent powers, right? By vectors, right? It's stuff acting on other stuff in a certain direction, and mathematics is capable, right, of describing many of these processes, and that alone should suffice for telling us, stop. Maybe there's meaning there, meaning that we harvest fields of sense, meaning that we harvest with conceptual activities such as mathematizing nature, but also meaning that we harvest in our modes of life. So I do believe, for instance, right, people ask this, right, in their everyday life, are there meaningful encounters? Did I have to fall in love with this person, right? Or does it mean something that I went through this life crisis and then had this other job? And my answer to this is yes, it means something. So if you like, there's fate and destiny, but there's a philosophical way of making sense of this, a non-theological way, by just accepting that meaning and sense of life is already there, ready for us to grasp it, right? And not produced by our modes of projecting human meaning onto an utterly meaningless universe.
And that's the idea of new realism.
Exactly. That's new realism for existentialists.
And this also means that we don't construct the reality. We have different ideas of reality, but there is a reality, and we can get the chance to understand it if we look at it, but not only from the perspective that we are familiar with.
Exactly. We cannot, the very idea of constructing a reality, I think, is nonsense. What we do is we produce new stuff, right? For better or for worse. We produce AIs, which then destroy the environment, right? Just training one AI system is a horrible idea from the standpoint of sustainability, and a horrible idea from the standpoint of the future of democracy. I think we just should stop doing it. There are activities that we shouldn't engage in. So we're not constructing a reality there. We are changing a reality that's already there, right? So of course we can change things, but this idea, this constructivist idea, that's still part of our worldview, makes us believe that humans have a kind of superpower, right? We bring meaning to an in itself meaningless universe. That would be an incredible superpower that we don't have.
Talking about meaning again, maybe step one, or get one step back, because you were talking before about the political and social freedom, because different meanings mean also that these meanings not always get together. And when we talk about the meaning in life, we also talk about the question of what does it mean to live a good life. And then we talk about political freedom, which means also social freedom, you state in your book. And during this pandemic, this question of freedom was raised a lot by many people because it was restricted. However, individual and collective freedom are often experienced as contradictory. And you disagree with this view and instead advocate for what you call radical autonomy. Can you explain this to us?
Yeah. So the starting point of this idea is the concept of social freedom. And the starting point is simply this. Most things that humans are interested in doing are things they can only do with others. So what makes me more free? Being alone in a room or playing tennis with my wife? Okay? Playing tennis with my wife. We don't play tennis, we play badminton, but anyhow. So my tennis playing is horrible. It was just a fantasy. But, okay, so what makes me more free? Being alone in my room, right, and writing Twitter messages, though this is almost social, or having a nice meal and then a concert at the Elbphilharmonie. So the idea then is that freedom is not at all something that an individual has in opposition to a community, which puts constraints on the individual. That's not even freedom. That's something that an individual, there are individual rights, of course, right? But the concept of an individual right, which we have and should have, is not identical to the concept of freedom. And there has been this horrible confusion in the German debate about liberal democracy recently, and therefore also a serious threat to liberal democracy in Germany by the progressives. And I find that a horrible, perverse kind of discursive constellation, that we want a democracy in the, that's not liberal. We should always emphasize the liberal in liberal democracy, and this has nothing to do with a particular German party, not at all, right? So why do we even accept the idea that freedom is something that I have as an individual as opposed to a group? That's the Sartre mistake that Simone de Beauvoir corrected, right? So we are social through and through, and not, we don't have to enter into social bonds. That's the starting point. And radical autonomy in this picture is the idea that my self-determination, right, takes place in the context of a mutual self-determination. We determine each other to individually determine ourselves, and this gives rise to the law. As Hegel put it, defining the law at the beginning of his philosophy of right, what's the law? He says, free will, which wills free will. Der freie Wille, der den freien Willen will. So it's not just my autonomy, it's the fact that I desire your autonomy and the fact that you desire my autonomy in this conversation by sharing roles, by exchanging thoughts, by being respectful with each other, by trying to read each other's minds, right? Your generosity of hosting this in your podcast, the generosity of the new institute, right, etc., etc. My answer, that's currently too long. All of that, right, is engaging in social freedom. And that's the way in which we should discuss also our crises. We shouldn't have the debate, right, how can we constrain more freedom so that we save the planet, right? And then someone says, but we want those freedoms. And then we're like, damn, how can we have those freedoms and save the planet? That's a horrible discursive deadlock. So what we need instead is a new type of social contract, which begins with the recognition that we really like each other.
Interesting. And this all is connected to moral, to ethics, the question of what does it mean to live a good life and to make it possible for as many people as possible on this earth and not only for a small part. And that's what the last chapter of your book is all about, and it seems to me to be the heart of your theory, the ethics of not knowing. And I'm asking myself if the ethics of not knowing means that we not only have to say goodbye to the idea of overcoming our problems by controlling the world and nature, but if we also have to give up the belief that we live in a knowledge-based society.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that I just recently looked also into the history of how this idea of a knowledge-based society, in 1966 the term was coined as knowledgeable society, then became Wissensgesellschaft and knowledge society. And then, of course, there was this backlash, populism, and then people started saying, we live in a society of stupidity. But, just that distinction, is flawed by itself. Because, we never lived in that kind of knowledge society. We just think we do. There's this wonderful, famous line by Max Weber that's typically misunderstood. Max Weber says in this famous line, modernity is the disenchantment of nature and what he also calls rationalization. And then typically people read this as saying, oh, look, science and technology take over with a little economics, and then there are expert committees and they make big decisions, and this is how society moves. And Max Weber said that this is modernity. No, what Max Weber actually says, if you read this quote, is that this is a faith, ein Glaube of modernity, and that this faith does not correspond to the facts. So what Max Weber actually says is that the disenchantment of nature of the world is an illusion, a socially relevant illusion. So it matters that humans believe this, obviously, but they get this wrong. We have never been in the control seat at all. It's just that it strikes us as if we were in a control seat. If we drive on German highways, with high speed, then this feels to some people as if they had like super crazy control over what's happening, right? But it's of course the opposite. What you're doing there is, like it's a controlled experiment in suicide. Right, in particular as you come closer to Munich, and this is, I feel, typically a very bad part of, for driving for certain reasons. So, and I think that's, why do we even want those highways, right? I mean, think about the German debates about the speed limit, and they show us something, I think, about a pathology and not about a legitimate desire to, drive cars like in Munich. And so I think fundamentally, we have never been in the control seat. It's just that we thought for a long time that we were. And what these crises right now teach us, in a way that, nobody can deny and ignore, is that we're not masters of nature.
So you write in your book also, ethics starts with the respect for otherness. What does this attitude of not knowing, of thinking that I don't have the control over everything, I don't know everything, what does that for us as human beings and the way that we interact with the world mean?
Well, I think that, it allows us to always question a prejudice that we have in any type of social situation, right? I mean, the philosopher Gadamer in a Spiegel interview once said, the other could be right. And I want to extend that also to other parts of nature, not just to humans. Yeah, so I'm not saying if you meet someone who says, the Russians just had to attack Ukraine, NATO was pushing them. No, that's wrong, right? So I'm not saying, consider that, right? Or there's no pandemic. I'm not saying, think about that, they might be right. I'm really thinking about actual ethically relevant situations where, we classify humans all the time, right? Rapidly. And so we think in stereotypes. Identities and that, right? And I think thinking in terms of otherness is not thinking of the other in terms of the stereotypes that we have in order to explain their behavior. Stereotypes and identities serve the function of predicting behavior. They're just really bad sociology. So if I think of, for instance, as I just did intentionally, stereotypes about Munich, right? They just complained. I was on a podcast in Munich. They're like, what about the bashing of the South? All these people from Hamburg. I had to tell them, no, don't worry. I'm not really from Hamburg, right? So I'm more with you. I'm from Bonn. It's like I'm already on your side. But be that as it may, right? So there's this stereotypical thinking. And I think otherness means that you don't expect, you see a white old man from Munich who votes CSU and there's like, oh, he's going to destroy the environment. Well, how do you know? Maybe he's like the biggest defender of solar panels in his village. How do you know that, right? So, and being open here means that, don't succumb to your own stereotypical prejudices. Otherwise get rid of your social media accounts.
But how is that possible? I mean, we have experiences in life, and it seems like people are using also stereotypes to, like, even if they are not good, of course. That's nothing that I'm asking myself. But still, I ask myself if it's possible for us as humans, if it's something that we do maybe also not intentionally.
Well, I do think it's part of a utopia, right? I would admit that. If I say it's possible, this is an element of utopian thinking, right? I'm not saying, practice a little more and, we'll get there very soon. But I think that it should be the ideal that we're striving towards. And the ideal scenario would be one where we do really see the individual, right? I think individualism and liberal individualism are exactly the right idea. It's just that historically speaking, there are bad traditions which, didn't cash this in the right way. We know this now, right? All the colonial horrors associated with certain traditions and thinking about this. But I think the idea is exactly right. They're individual rights precisely because we're individuals. We're atomic in that sense, right? Which is the Greek term, also contemporary Greek term for a person, an atomon. Someone, right, is an atomon, individual, cannot be divided. So otherness, right, respecting otherness is trying to find the other in the encounter, right, without othering, right? Othering would be the idea that, your otherness is this otherness. Otherness is not this otherness, right? This particular otherness that I know, right? You're a Syrian refugee, that's your otherness. Otherness is like you don't even know exactly where it lies. Let me give you another simple example. We tended to think for a long time about the pandemic as a bunch of individual particles hitting us, right? And if you have too many of them, you get infected. But what if we thought, I discussed this a lot with virologists and doctors from other disciplines, if we thought of viruses as swarm attacks, right? This changes your attitude towards them. And that's one way of being open to the otherness of the virus. Don't think about this as a bunch of particles hitting you, but as a swarm attack. And I do think it's still a swarm attack. That's one of the reasons why you cannot end a pandemic with vaccines. It's just good to get vaccines, right? But that not because you thereby end the pandemic, but because you protect yourself and others. That's very different from let's end the pandemic. And so there you see what otherness could bring, right? You think about the scenario by being open-minded about hidden dimensions of the structure and not assuming that you kind of have already a full grip on this. And this would be a very different attitude also in social situations, right? So you meet people who you think you can classify, right? And then you start, thinking about why did I classify this person in this way, right? And then you begin mutually checking these classifications in order to overcome them.
So not knowing everything is something good if we look at it from this perspective.
Absolutely. It's the origin of ethics. The first and still valid statement, was, why is Socrates the most wise person? Is the good old question. And this is part of the definition of humans as sapiens, by the way, right? So why are we called sapiens? Again, Harari doesn't even address this question because this is a reference to Socrates, who said that we are, to Socrates' concept of wisdom. And in Carl Linnaeus, who coined the term Homo sapiens, books, System of Nature, if you read what he says about humans, he doesn't define us in the way in which he defines other animals and plants by taxonomy. He just writes in Latin, nosce te ipsum, know thyself. And that's a reference to Socrates. Sapiens, wisdom, we are the wise animals. And what is wisdom here? Wisdom, Socrates is the wisest person because Socrates does not make the knowledge claims of his community. He meets the general who knows what a just war is and then asks the general, and he doesn't know what justice is, he doesn't even know what a war is, right? And then he meets the artist, the greatest, most distinguished artist, but they don't know what art is. And so what Socrates teaches us is that not knowing everything is compatible with being skillful, right? And it's the shape that wisdom should take. That's what Homo sapiens was intended to mean.
Two last questions before we start the discussion, because I'm sure a lot of you are keen on asking questions. Even though we don't know everything, there are moral facts, you state in your book. There are moral facts that we can actually know. And I would like to know, what could this be? Like, how can I know?
Well, I think, that's, of course, a tough one. First I would always begin addressing this before I theorize about this with examples, right? So imagine you ask yourself the meaningful question, should I throw that newborn baby down those stairs, right? And if you still wonder, it's like, and then you read Kant and the categorical imperative, should I, so you read the whole literature and Confucius and you consult your wise friends and the rabbi, right, in order to know whether you should throw that, Then this is what the philosopher Bernard Williams has called one thought too many, right? So if you need an argument concerning the question whether you should throw that newborn baby down the stairs, then you already made a mistake. So there has to be knowledge of something that we ought or not to do that's not grounded in a complicated reasoning process. That's different from knowledge in physics, which is always grounded in complicated reasoning processes. I call those things the morally obvious facts. But there are, of course, morally less obvious facts, right? More difficult cases. And for those, we need to develop a heuristics, which we don't fully have yet. And I would argue that the humanities and social sciences are a significant contribution to the heuristics of answering more difficult situations. For instance, what would be the moral fact concerning a particular decision in fighting the pandemic? I don't think that we really tried. I think that we randomly made some political decision or others, right? And then we randomly survived the pandemic to some extent, right? But there has not really been any serious ethical thinking. Maybe, this was also too urgent and dangerous. Maybe we didn't have enough time. But certainly there's no serious ethical treatise on how to fight that particular pandemic. It was more or less random and very politicized, and I find that problematic. So for the complicated cases, we need to develop a heuristics. But let's start with the simple ones, because they demonstrate that there are moral facts. So in general, a fact is a true answer to a meaningful question. So for instance, is 2 + 2 7 is a meaningful question? The answer is no. So it's not a fact, right? That's the general definition of a fact that I use. A moral fact is a fact that is a true answer to a moral question. What's a moral question? A moral question is a question concerning what we ought to do or not to do simply in virtue of our shared humanity. So if there's something that we should not do to each other because we are humans, then that's a moral fact. Moral facts have this universal character. That's the idea of a moral fact with which I'm working there.
And what does that mean in practical terms? I'm asking myself. What do you wish for so that an ethics of not knowing and moral progress is happening?
Well, we should make strong, clear, transparent, and reasonably argued moral claims. Then bring in all the evidence that we can gather, moral evidence and not moral evidence, right? That's part of the reason why it matters so much now in political discourse, progressive discourse, that we bring in the perspective of repressed people, victims, minorities, etc., generally many perspectives, in order for us to explore, right, the moral and non-moral facts to get a much fuller picture of what's actually at stake. Right? In the pandemic, one should have wondered exactly about those questions as well. Not all people were affected by a lockdown in exactly the same way, right? If you're a billionaire, then the lockdown is cozy, you stick to your swimming pool, right? If you lose your job, etc., plus your grandmother dies because she doesn't get good treatment, etc., right? Then that's different. So one would have to have had, right, all these perspectives in order to figure this out. Then make strong claims, right? Vaccine mandate, yes or no. Right? But know that those claims that you make are defeasible. They can be wrong. So you have to be otherness. Ethics of not knowing means that you have to be open to incoming evidence and then immediately correct. So make the strong claim, but be seriously open about correcting the strong claim in light of incoming evidence. This would have been the attitude. We didn't have this, right? It seemed that we had it because a bunch of virologists, were playing that game, the game of science, but not in ethics. The ethical claims that we made were all dogmatic, typically not so founded in evidence, or just, people were just trying to read the ethics of the pandemic off from some popular statements by famous virologists. But that is a mistake. Virologists are no better in ethics than the typical ethicist is in virology. Actually, they are often worse even, but okay, that would be a longer story.
But talking about different perspectives and that we need them to progress, I would suggest that we open up this discussion and let us hear what our guests, our audience is thinking, if you agree.
Absolutely. Thank you, Marilena.
Thank you. Of course, also thank you very much for listening. I hope you could take something away from the conversation with Markus Gabriel and get small impressions of what he's talking about in his book. If so, I would be very happy if you support my work by sharing this podcast and or by supporting it financially. You can do that, as I already mentioned at the beginning, easily via Steady or even via PayPal. More information on that is found in the show notes. That is it for today. See you hopefully next time at Sinneswandel Podcast.